Okay, so like Rob said, the title of this presentation, which he gave me, was Mastering WordPress Post Queries. About a month ago, when we were talking about what subject I could discuss, I had mentioned that this project that we were working on was pretty interesting from a dev standpoint. We basically were creating a plugin to let us customize the category filtering. So like in WordPress, you can go to like /category/news and you see all the news posts. But what if you wanted to see, pardon me, like all of the posts in news and press releases together, and you wanted a nice little URL that was like category or /category/news plus press releases, so it's easy to share. You can't do that out of the box in WordPress, and there are plugins that do that type of stuff, but none of them fit the needs that we wanted, so we wrote our own. And that's what I was going to talk about, but then I kind of realized there's a whole bunch of things before that that you should know and be aware of before we can even hop into that. So that being said, the way that I've structured this is we're going to go through and look at what I consider to be the 4 core ways that you can extend WordPress beyond just dropping in plugins. So all of this is from a code writing perspective. And those things are in order as we're going to approach them: hooks, custom post types, custom taxonomies, and custom fields. After we've gone over all of that, we're going to move on to looking at the class called WP Query, which is the core of how you talk to WordPress to get stuff out of the database. And then finally, we're going to go to that grand finale that I had just mentioned and look at all of this together in action. And I have, I'm going to be hopping in and out of the presentation to show some of the websites that we've done this on. Like I'll log you into the back end, and so we can look at it both from a front end and a back end perspective. I have some code samples throughout in here, but I didn't want to get too heavy into syntax and that granular. So the goal of this is just to introduce you to these concepts, because the WordPress Codex has all these examples and you don't need to listen to me regurgitate that stuff. So before we go any further, these 4 concepts, how aware of them are you, or have you used? Pretty decent? Okay, cool. So first off, into hooks. So if you guys know, you guys are already exposed to hooks. They are the core of how we extend WordPress, both from a theme and plugin perspective. They allow us to customize what WordPress does by default. And hooks are generally the general umbrella for 2 types of behaviors: actions and filters. And in premise, they end up being pretty similar in what you can and can't do. The basic gist is an action is an event, like user has logged in. A filter is going to be modifying markup that WordPress has made for you. So like when you call the content in your theme, there are a series of filters that markup in the WYSIWYG editor passes through to present the final markup that is returned from that function. There are an awful lot of hooks. I looked just before this, and the last number that I could find as of WordPress 4.4 was 1,917. So I just said nearly 2,000. And it's probably more than that by now. So pretty much everything that WordPress does from start to end, you can hop in and customize. And so it's like, yeah, if I want to do something at the very end or at the very beginning, like to the point of the content, or maybe a custom authentication, custom action when a certain type of user logs in, all of those possibilities are there. It's just your imagination that's the bound. And finally, a lot of plugins, big guys like WooCommerce, Advanced Custom Fields, the Events Calendar, they extend the hook system with custom hooks of their own. So if those plugins are robust enough that you can even modify their behavior in the same manner that you're used to with core WordPress functionality. Again, because I haven't rehearsed this, I might say some things that I've gotten to before. Okay, so basically, yeah, there's no complete and thorough documentation for hooks, unfortunately. Even the WordPress Codex doesn't have everything covered. So sometimes to figure out what you want to do and if you can do it, you need to dive into the source code. And WordPress is open source, so that's easy to do. Every one of your installations, your WP includes and WP admin folder, you can just go pop open those and look for a call to do action, and then go from there. So these are what two example calls look like, both an action and a filter. There's more arguments that these functions can take. Again, for simplicity, I omitted all of that. But the basic gist is your first argument is what you're wanting to hook onto. Then the second one is the name of the function you want executed at that point in time. And these are examples of those two functions. So in this case, well, actually, I'll explain a little more. So that action after setup theme happens when WordPress loads up your theme file and is getting ready to take the next step, render content, present to the user. So that's your opportunity to tell WordPress what your theme can and can't do, and potentially register some additional functionality or do your plumbing stuff. The filter excerpt more is a way to control the markup and copy that appears when someone calls the excerpt or the content, and that gets appended to the output. So yeah, these are two simple little examples of those functions. With new excerpt more, you can see I just I wanted to format it with a raquel apparently, and that wasn't default at the time. And so that's a very simple little thing. The argument passed in, $more, that is actually the content as WordPress generated it. So WordPress said, I made you your read more link, here it is, now do something else to it. I decided to not care about that at all and just build my own and return it. That's okay. Like, you can work as little or as much with what they're passing down as you desire. And then that theme setup function, I'm just telling WordPress that I have menus that you can manage in the menu manager, and that I have post thumbnail support, so I can use the featured image thing. And there's a lot of more granular theme support options that you can get into, especially with some of the newer improvements to the visual editor customization in the back. This is the bare bones of how you start going to provide those things to your users. So that's the gist of hooks for now, as I want to cover it. Before I move on to custom post types, any questions?
That first thing you did, would that be equivalent to anything in a Microsoft product? Back up
Yeah.
one slide.
Yep.
Yeah, the after setup thing.
Yes.
Is that an event?
It's a good way to think of it. And it's similar to callbacks or events in JavaScript. This is that concept applied in this regard. But I'd say the big difference between like an event in C# or .NET is there's not a standard Eventargs concept that you're receiving. Every one of the callback or event functions have different arguments. Some have none. Some take strings, some might take an object or receive an object or an array. It's all across the board.
Thank you.
Yep. Anything else? Okay. So custom post types are, I think they were introduced in WordPress 2.8 or something like that. Very, very much needed. Basically, pages and posts are, in WordPress technical terms, post types, and they have different capabilities. Like we think about our blog posts being listed chronologically. Pages are a standalone entity that are never viewed in a list. There might be instances where you want something more, like going back to the events example. Like, I could use blog posts to describe events, but then maybe those are getting cluttered in with my other posts. I don't like that. I want to fix that. So I can create a custom post type called events and have that be in its own little separate organized container where I can have all the content, both from a front end perspective and a back end perspective, organized more neatly. If this seems a little abstract, I think it'll get clearer as we go on, especially when I show you some of the examples. So custom post types, again, just like we saw with the hooks, they ultimately are created in code. There's a function that you call that we'll see. Actually, we'll just go here. But there are actually plugins that offer a visual approach to actually customizing and creating your post types. So you can do all of this stuff in admin. I didn't want to show plugins since this was a dev perspective, just the base code of what you would need to get it done. And this is, so gist of it, in all WordPress functions are fairly monolithic in how they behave. We're registering the post type people and giving it arguments, customizing what we want it to be. I was just making sure I didn't have an elaboration slide. So there's a whole slew of options we can specify different things that it supports, as we can see here. Labels for an admin and all sorts of little granular control. But this is just the gist. You get how it works. I define what base WordPress capabilities I want this thing to support. And then once this is created, in your little admin sidebar, you would have a menu link called People, right alongside Pages and Posts, and that goes for as many different post types as you have. Before I move on to custom taxonomies, any questions? Okay. So, taxonomy is kind of a weird word. It's like, what does that mean? And I've just pulled from Wikipedia because they said it best. The branch of science that encompasses the description, identification, nomenclature, and classification of organisms. In short, it is the science of creating categories for different things. Like we generally, as people, just like call everything categorization, but like we have more specific types of categorization, and they have different behaviors. WordPress has two taxonomies built in. That's categories and tags. And the key difference is categories have hierarchy. So you have parents and children. You know, it's like maybe you have recipes, and then under that you have lunch, dinner, breakfast. Whereas tags are flat. They have no relation to one another. They're equal, one and the same. And so then we think about, well, we could use categories and tags for everything. That works. Like we've got the bases covered there. But when you are describing when you think about custom post types and you're describing different kinds of content, you maybe have categorization structures that don't overlap. The example I have here is it's like recipes have ingredients. So rather than just use categories and cross-pollute with like whatever's being used in your blog, let's just make a separate taxonomy so that we have that information hierarchy organized and contained. And of course, a little code sample. Registering taxonomies looks very, very similar to registering a custom post type. You can specify, I think probably the most important customization with taxonomies is whether they're hierarchical or not. And the right answer to that is it depends on your information architecture, what problem you're trying to solve. If you want something that feels like categories, it's hierarchical. Otherwise, it's tags. Any questions?
It'll also largely change how you operate with those from the admin side as well. So, like you said, hierarchical or flat, like basically think about it like this. If you want the ability to just type in a word, hit enter, and have it show up with a bubble and an X on it, it's going to be flat and it's going to be non-hierarchical. If you want to have like the checkbox thing where you can check boxes to associate the post with the thing, then it's hierarchical. Like that's like an easy way to think about it, I think. I think it's always a good idea to think about how it relates to what you see on the admin.
Yep. And that's why as soon as I get through custom fields, we're going to hop over and look at a few different sites that we've built that all of these things are illustrated. So custom fields, has everyone here used custom fields? Are you familiar? Okay. For me, this is probably the biggest and richest extensibility point because it applies to all of the things that I just mentioned. It's like those are your foundations and things, and then custom fields give you substance to hook onto. Like an example, well, let's just read what I wrote. So everything that you do with custom fields, you could just cram into your WYSIWYG editor. And you could have classes and all that stuff in there. That's a bad idea because your end users, especially when they're editing in WYSIWYG mode, they might delete your H2 class subhead and not know. And then your formatting breaks on the front end. So if I were to break out those areas, I'll say it like this, areas that I need more granular control on the front end, I can poke little holes in my page so that I force people to give me like my subhead, my call out quote, and an image. And then I can stitch those together in the markup I want and control in my template. And so in practice, all the sites that I'm going to show you are usually a combination of a collection of custom fields for those important pieces, and then the WYSIWYG editor for just like your catch-all kitchen sink content and just relying on base formatting without classes. So like having, sensible defaults for unordered lists, paragraphs, H1s through H6. That way we're not putting too much burden on the user. WordPress has a pretty crude, at this point, custom value system that is just name and value. That doesn't offer any formatting. It's just like two text boxes side by side. Again, that's not very nice for the users. There is an incredible plugin, probably the best WordPress plugin that exists from a developer's perspective, called Advanced Custom Fields, that lets you not only add custom fields, but specify different formatting and conditional types. Like there's a really cool field called OEmbed that lets you paste a video URL, not an embed code, like from one of like about 50 different sites, and it'll actually do like a little API call to YouTube and get the appropriate embed code. So it's a nice example of making it easy for the user. It's a lot easier for them to copy a URL, paste it in, and have the computer figure it out than tell them to like go to the share tab and copy this, but remember strip out length and width and all that yucky stuff. So very cool. We're going to look at it soon. So WP Query, I mentioned this at the beginning. This is actually, well, before I go, any questions? Okay. So WP Query is a class that is provided by WordPress that is really the foundation of all of WordPress, from its built-in plumbing and then how we tend to extend things on the front end if we're talking to the database. So everyone here is familiar with the loop and the template tags that we use for that. Behind the scenes, there's a WP query object that WordPress is constructing for you based on the URL that you're on, and then populating it so that you can do wall, have posts, the posts, and all that. And WP Query's reason for existence is to abstract the database away from us. Like, it's a bridge between those. We could write SQL queries directly that would meet the same end that WP Query does, and in some cases that could be easier. But the problem there is we don't control that database. WordPress does. So if they updated it, they decided they want to change a column name, that'll break. When we talk, or our code will then break, and we have to go fix it. When we talk through WP Query, we have a guaranteed contract, so we can write it and be not worried that it's going to break in the future. So times that you would use WP Query, if you're creating custom post types, like we will look at soon, then you probably are going to be getting into instances where you might want to be cross-promoting different content or using those posts in a non-traditional way from a WordPress perspective. An interesting example of this is we have one site that has a Google map that all the locations of the business's stores are plotted on. and we created a custom post type called locations, and then using advanced custom fields, we added a location field which uses Google Maps, and so they can type in an address and we get the latitude, longitude, so we can plot it on a map in addition to having that address on hand and all the other little busy bits about the business. So then we wrote a query to pull all those from the database and then bam, plot them, initialize them on a Google map. And that type of thing would just be a nightmare to do in vanilla WordPress without any of these kind of tools. And touching on the same thing, so like without custom post types and the reusability that it offers, if you wanted to have FAQs like peppered throughout your site, you might be forced to make separate copies of them and then have content duplication. That's not good. You need to remember to change it in 4 places. If you use a custom post type and you're pulling those in with your own queries, then you write it once and it's the same everywhere. So this is probably the tiniest and arguably least useful WP query you might see. Again, it's just for basics. I explain what's going on the next slide, so I'm just going to hop over. Well, actually, I'll speak to it first. So we're querying the database, we're checking to see if we have posts, and then we're looping through and we're printing out an unordered list of the titles of those posts. So, new WP query. This is telling WordPress, hey, I want you to talk to the database and then filter posts by these conditions. So this array, we only have 2 values in it right now, but there are tons and tons and tons of criteria that you can use to hone and filter your posts. And like I touched on a little earlier with SQL, ultimately these things are translated into either where clauses or join against other tables behind the scenes. They make it so you don't have to worry about that. I suppose that's another benefit of using WP queries. You don't need to learn SQL on top of everything else we already need to know. And this query is structured such that it can run inside of the main loop. I'm not going to get into it because I think it's a little too deep in the weeds for this. We can talk later if you want, but there are ways to use WP query outside of the loop and not use template tags. This example is set up such that you can use the template tags that you're used to with your main default loop query. But you can access the data in a more raw and ultimately granular format if you so choose. That final line, which isn't necessarily very obvious, that WP reset post data, again, because we're in the context of the main loop, you need to call that. Otherwise, when you go back to rendering the rest of your page, WordPress is going to be goofed up and it won't know to go back to your other posts, if that makes sense. So I said we can query on a lot of things, and that is a lot of things. Pretty much any which way you could slice an object or concept in WordPress, you can filter by it. And for every one of these things, be it author, category, tag, you can say I want to get all the posts in this category except category Y, or show me the authors who have created posts in the last 3 months and also are tagged ham, or any combination of these things you can put together. And I mean, you see we've got custom taxonomies and post types and custom fields peppered in on top of this. So I mean, in short, pretty much any way you can imagine slicing your data and getting a view of that, there are arguments that you can pass to WP query to get that. And you can even talk to the media library through it too. It's kind of funny, in WordPress, from a back-end perspective, everything is a post, where they're just viewed in different ways. Media objects are posts, nav items are posts, pages are posts, posts are posts. It's a common distilled back-end structure that all of this stuff builds off of. So all of this stuff that we've just talked to, introducing the WP query, our custom post types, we now have roughly enough knowledge to start thinking about modifying the master loop. the one that our base files always like hook on. We'll all have posts, the post, and we go through that. So how do we do that? Well, surprise, surprise, there is a filter to start modifying this. And there are a few different places that you can hook in, but this is one of the earliest pre-Git posts. And this point, WordPress has figured out what it wants to query from the database, but it hasn't actually done it yet. So it's our opportunity to modify that and change what we get. So this query post type function we can see is defined here. It takes one argument to my knowledge, and that is the WP query object that it has constructed, but again, not run. And I break down what I'm doing over here. So this does look a little confusing. What am I doing? This is from Bozell.com actually, and when you were browsing categories, I wanted multiple post types to be included so that you could have an aggregate look at like all the work that's associated with a given category, the people, and our blog posts. So that if block is, I'm checking using the template tags to see if I'm on my work type taxonomy page, or if I'm on a tag page or a category page. And if so, then I'm going to tell WordPress, hey, instead of just querying post, which you would have done by default if you were on a category page, include all these other post types, please. And using that set line, I pass in that array, and then voila, it does it. Let's see here. So that is a very simple and straightforward example of modifying the default WP query. You can get really, really involved. It's just how far you want to go. What I'm about to show you, this site isn't live yet. I have my hosts file updated, pointed so you can see it, but it should be live tomorrow. So if you go to SueHoney or SueBee.com tomorrow, you'll be able to see this. So we have this big recipe section. The client had over 1,500 recipes that they wanted included on the site, which we have done for them, and you can browse them with this nice infinite load scroll thing. Not anything especially new, but we are using push state to keep track of the URL and where we're at. And so if I went and shared this link, it would reconstruct the page as that. And then if we can go a little crazier, and all of these filters right here, these are categories from a back-end perspective that these posts are tagged with. And so if I want something that is apples, so I've got some stuff there, and dishes, let's see here, pie, I want something that, so we have 4. So now if we look, the URL, we now see that I've got, this is the structure that we decided on, but I have both apples and main dishes included in here. And on the back end side of things, we have, using that pre-Git post thing, we're doing URL inspection, and we're slicing those things apart, and we're modifying that default query to include posts that have both apples and main dishes. And I can actually then do search as well, and that is all preserved and part of it. So there's our one, and we can then see that is also reflected in the URL. So I can send that to someone and they can see exactly what I did.
Yo, that is really freaking cool. I don't know if you guys know how cool it is. That is awesome. Very impressive.
And on the code would be way too much to get into right now. There's a lot of moving pieces like I talked about. We're looking at the URL, we're doing regex stuff to deconstruct that, and then hooking in all these little bits and pieces. It's better just to know that you can do it. You have seen everything you need to get there. Oh. So another one of our backends, a bunch of different post types.
That's a pretty big client, huh?
Yeah.
worth putting that to work.
I had mentioned actually the map thing earlier. This is the site I was talking about. So they have, Sioux Honey is a co-op, which means that there are a bunch of independent farmers that all get together under a common banner. And these are all of the 310 apiaries across our fine country. And if we zoom in, so the plan long term is for there to be a lot more rich beekeeper focused content. We just have like one guy who has much of a story right now, but everybody eventually will have some content going on there. And on the back end, how we achieved that was we go to our beekeepers and 307, I'm sorry. So if I go in here and edit this, there's that location, and we're able to use the lat long on the front end to plot that stuff. And if I put some copy in here, it would show up in that info bubble. Let's see what's going on with recipes. So we've got custom excerpt. This is actually the built-in WordPress excerpt that we, for reasons it's not worth getting into, we decided to skin as a WYSIWYG editor, so it was a little nicer. And video embed stuff, more of the same that I've shown you. This also has WooCommerce on it. It's a big one.
How long have you guys been working on this site?
Planning since January. Development probably began in mid-February, and we just finished yesterday.
How many developers do you have working on this?
I have had, at any given time, I believe, up to 3. Well, actually, no, 4 if you include myself, but there were 2 dedicated for the majority of the project. So yeah, Sioux Honey's a nice site. I'm proud of it from a dev perspective. Go poke it, find bugs, and let me know, because I'm sure they're there. All right, so in conclusion, and so we've covered what I consider to be the 4 key developer extensibility points in WordPress: custom post types, fields, taxonomies, and hooks. And as we've seen, they are pretty powerful, pretty cool things. And I had touched on this earlier, that they can be used interchangeably, to Rob's point about, I've just shown you now 2 examples where I used the location list as a custom field, and then location list as custom post type. It's situational, which the right one is for your problem that you're trying to solve. And we've seen how WP Query lets you do cool stuff with all your custom post types. And if you're brave enough, you can go in and modify the main loop. But you do need to be careful, because that loop is used literally everywhere in WordPress, the back end, the front end. And so you can accidentally pollute admin, if you will, with things that you're intending for the front end. So there's a lot. The more complicated you get, like what you saw there are a lot of considerations to take in. So by all means do it, but just be aware of what you're getting into. I think that's all I got. Any questions?